Hello, my name is Dave Emory, and this is Side 1 of For the Record program number 731, interview with John Loftus about America's Nazi secret. This program is being recorded on December 5th of the year 2010. Once again, it's my pleasure and privilege to bring back to our airwaves John Loftus, former Justice Department investigator and the author of, in its old form, The Belarus Secret, The Secret War Against the Jews, Unholy Trinity, the last two co-authored with Mark Ahrens, The Witness Tree, and most recently published in softcover by Trine Day Publishers, America's Nazi Secret. John, welcome back to our airwaves.
Thank you, Dave. Always a pleasure to be with you.
Well, over the years, finally, the veil of censorship/secrecy has fallen still more from some of the things, not only the things that you've been investigating, but from the investigations that you've conducted themselves. And for people that have followed your work over the years, there are things in America's Nazi Secret about just exactly what it is that you've been contending with in order to bring us all this information for this long period of time.
You know, Dave, it's funny. 30 years ago when I wrote The Belarus Secret, the Justice Department and other agencies censored the heck out of it. And now, 30 years later, I'm free to write about it. And they've sort of walked into their own trap. They wouldn't have censored this stuff out of my book 30 years ago unless it was true. And now they can't deny it. It's funny, my book came out on Veterans Day in November, and 3 days later the Justice Department leaked a 600-page report to the New York Times, apologizing, justifying their efforts, and admitting that, in fact, the U.S. government, did recruit some Nazis, and we might have lied about some stuff to the courts. But the idea was that before a single review could be written about my book, they wanted to get their story out and plead to the misdemeanor because they knew I was going to charge them with the felony. There are people in the Justice Department who belong in prison. They lied to Congress. They orchestrated one fraud after another. And this isn't just, one little episode. This is something that goes back to the 1920s when the Justice Department was protecting those great American families who funded Hitler.
John, on that note, why don't we begin setting the events? Now, obviously, we've spoken about a fair amount of this in previous programs, but for people that are new, and in order to understand why the Justice Department would go to extraordinary lengths, and not just the Justice Department, but other institutions to cover this up, why don't we take a look at just what it was they were covering up, and beyond that, who it was that was doing what they were covering up. John, do you think it would be fair to describe the Webb-Pomerene Act and the actions of the robber barons at the end of World War I as either a manifestation of or perhaps the beginning of what we think of as globalization?
Oh, that's so true. When President Teddy Roosevelt banned monopolies, trusts, and cartels in America, the Webb-Pomerene Act of 1918 allowed American corporations, the robber barons of Wall Street, to set up monopolies, trusts, and cartels overseas. So these crooked companies bought three countries. They funded the infant Nazi Party of Germany, the infant Bolshevik Party of Russia, and what became the House of Saud. Basically, they funded three terrorist groups to take control of three countries that would allow them to set up their monopolies, trusts, and cartels.
John, let's give us some of the nomenclature, some of the people, and some of the venerable institutions in this country that are the perps of the things you're going to describe.
Yeah, this is both Republicans and Democrats. On the Democratic side, everybody knows about Joe Kennedy, but they don't know that Joe Kennedy bought his Nazi stock from Prescott Bush. Okay? Prescott Bush's father-in-law, Herbert Walker, was the evil genius that put this stuff together. The Harrimans were the great Democratic family. They funded the Bolsheviks, and they put together a deal with Walker, the Rockefellers, the Bushes, to set up joint operations that would have, because of the money they pumped in the early Bolshevik Party, they had sort of a monopoly of Russian raw material exports. And because of the money that the Bushes, the Walkers, the Rockefellers, the DuPonts had pumped into Germany, they had a monopoly on the German high-tech patent stuff. So they wanted to build an industrial park. Because of the difference in the rail lines, it had to be, in eastern Poland near the Russian border, because the rail gauges were different. And the idea was to bring in Russian raw material by rail and then by barge. So they actually had dug the canals to the industrial park. And then the Germans would build a big factory to extract additives from coal, things that could be used for Russian aviation fuel additives. Now, so they had to have a place near a big coal mine. That was the province of Silesia, on the Vistula River where the canals could be dug, and near the Russian border. So they picked the little Polish village of Auschwitz. And America's finest families helped work with the Russians to build Auschwitz as a profit center. Now, people like Harriman claim that, oh no, we got out of it as soon as the war began. Not true. Not true. Harriman filed proxy statements to keep control of the company during the war. The Silesian American Coal Company was run by none other than Prescott Bush, the father of the 41st president and grandfather of 43. These were despicable people. They made a profit on both sides of World War II. The only thing they had going for them was their lawyers. The Dulles brothers were brilliant lawyers who covered up their clients' Nazi investments. And they got away with it. I had secret files turned over as late as 1971. The Rockefeller's Bank, the Chase Manhattan Bank, owned 38%, of the ThyssenKrupp Corporation, the largest and wealthiest conglomerate in Europe. Both Thyssen and Krupp were convicted Nazi war criminals. Both were clients of the Dulleses.
Of course, the
worked out really well.
Thiesen's business partners with George Herbert Walker and Prescott Bush, as we've discussed in the past.
Yeah.
So with Webb Pomerene, basically, the antitrust acts of 1913 and Teddy Roosevelt were circumvented. And one of the things that you talk about in American Nazi Secrets, and I think America's Nazi Secret, and something that with the economic peril we all find ourselves in, I think rings in a very powerful way, and that is that the role of the reinvestment of American capital under Webb Pomerene abroad, and with the collapse of Wall Street and the onset of the Great Depression.
Sure, all the American investment capital was going out to Germany, Russia, and Saudi Arabia.
And again, I think, globalization is something that most of us think of as a recent phenomenon, but it is not. And the events that we're talking about, again, I think could be understood as a direct manifestation of what we think of as globalization. Right.
You have to understand how it began. And what the Wall Street robber barons knew was that you couldn't buy the U.S. government, but you could rent the Justice Department. Even at the Versailles Conference of World War I, the Attorney General of the United States was the bagman for the Dulles brothers and paying bribes to the other negotiators to make sure that American businessmen got a favored status in the World War I treaties. So it was all about money. I mean, these guys funded the Bolsheviks at the same time they funded the Nazis. They really didn't care much about ideology. All they cared about was profit.
One of the things that you talk about too, and this is something that we don't hear very much about at all, much like the Webb Pomerene Act, and that it was at it was a patent consortium in Dusseldorf in which the key industrial patents were basically going to be controlled by this same cabal of robber baron industrialists / financiers.
Yeah, they were going to control the world through interlocking patent agreements and lock out all other competitors, because Germany had sort of a high-tech monopoly in those days. It's hard to imagine now, but if you wanted to be a scientist, you'd better learn German, because that was the language in which science was written, and which all patents, particularly chemical patents, were controlled. The Dusseldorf Patent Conference of 1939 was going to be the way that the Wall Street robber barons took over the world economically, and it was only the advent of World War II that stopped them from doing it.
Allen Dulles and his partner in Sullivan and Cromwell, John Foster Dulles, had much to do with investing Wall Street money in the Nazis, and also one of the things you've written about in several books, including America's Nazi Secret, and that is the role of this same cabal of powerful white shoe lawyers and law firms and the robber barons in helping to set up the Muslim Brotherhood and the ultimate oxymoron, modern Saudi Arabia.
Yeah, people don't realize that they hired a radical group of Arab terrorists called the Wahhabis, after their religion, and armed them and the Americans wanted to break the back of the British monopoly on the Arabian Peninsula. They wanted to get oil. So they funded the terrorist group. The terrorist group threw the legitimate rulers of Mecca and Medina out, the Hashemite family, and then they called themselves the House of Saud. And the first thing the Saudis did, of course, was to get rid of the radical members of the Muslim Brotherhood. They were stupid, after all. And the next thing they did was to create Aramco, the Arab American Oil Company. So it was all about the money. So we funded the most bigoted, the most anti-Islamic group of racists on the planet, just so we could get an oil monopoly in a little tiny corner of the Arab Peninsula.
For some younger and newer listeners, if a lot of this seems far-fetched, just consider on the contemporary landscape, China, which certainly is not democratic in any way. It's the one large, quote, communist, unquote, state around, and yet, paradoxically, it's become, in many ways, the bastion of international capitalism. So people should think about it. And, of course, what they find attractive is the fact that you can't talk back to management in China.
Yeah, I think, their
human resources department is extremely one-sided.
Well, and that's how the robber barons looked at the Nazis. They didn't really like the Nazi party. They actually favored the Catholic and the conservative, the monarchist parties in Germany. Hitler was a dog on a chain, just somebody. They funded the Nazis to keep the communists, the trade unions down. Their inside man was Hitler's finance minister, Hjalmar Schacht, born in Brooklyn, close friend of the Wall Street robber barons. But when Hitler surprisingly became chancellor, the first thing that he did was to ban foreign ownership of German companies, because he knew that the Wall Street robber barons weren't his buddies. So that forced the Wall Street robber barons to buy secret control of Swiss banks, which owned German banks. The German banks owned the stock of German corporations. The German corporations owned the patents, and the merry game continued. So that's why the Swiss passed the Swiss Bank Secrecy Act of 1933 to allow the Wall Street robber barons to continue their economic domination of the Third Reich. 70% of the money that went to finance Hitler came out of Wall Street.
In Unholy Trinity, you and your co-author Mark Ahrens have also written about the powerful Vatican participation. And there's something you talk about in America's Nazi Secret as well, something that serves as a bookend of sorts, I think, conceptually, particularly for younger listeners. Of course, you've written and we've spoken in the past about Sullivan and Cromwell, the law firm that Allen Dulles and John Foster Dulles used to invest money for the Nazis, including on behalf of the Bush family. Sullivan and Cromwell to this day is a general counsel for Saudi bin Laden Group. One of the outcroppings of the doings of the robber barons in the Arabian Peninsula. John, I'd like to go into, as we develop this story, exactly what you encountered. The Bellara Secret is something that I read decades ago, and it's familiar up to a point with the veteran listeners. And yet you talk about what it took to bring not only the Bellara Secret, but your 60-minute segment to the light of day, which was no mean feat. Let's set some background, though, to some of the events that you were investigating, because a lot of this is just not known to people. Belarus, or White Ruthenia, or Bielorussia. What is that? And if you could set forth some of the tangled history of that region vis-a-vis the Ukraine and Poland and Russia and the Soviet Union, because it's factored in the tangled history of all of those places.
Yeah. Bielorussia was a little borderland area. For several centuries, the Tsars of Russia had allowed it to be a settlement area. There's a 70-mile wide strip of land along the Russian border where Jews were allowed to live because they were commercially important to Russia. And some of the cities and towns going from Lithuania down through Bielorussia were 90% Jewish. And they were wiped out during World War II. I mean, they're just absolutely destroyed. The Holocaust has been severely undercounted because they never had access to the Soviet archives until recently. Elie Wiesel, when he looked at my book, The Belarus Secret, was astounded. He didn't even know that there were Jewish communities of that size in that area. So the Belarusians, for geographical reasons, were the only land bridge between Europe and Russia. It was the traditional invasion route from every army from Napoleon on upwards. So the Belarusians collaborated with the Nazis, and they became pets. They were one of the few occupied countries to have their own Nazi puppet government, very high status, and they reduced the population of their own country from 10 million to 7 million. Mass murderers. Their atrocities were so cruel that German soldiers testified against them at Nuremberg. One guy named Dr. Stankiewicz was educated man, a doctor of humanities. He invented the sardine method of execution. His local policemen would round up the Jews and take them out to the ditches, have the Jews lay on top of each other head to toe so they could shoot through a double layer of bodies and save ammunition. A layer of dirt was shoveled over the wounded, a double layer of bodies, and so on. The worst part about the sardine method was when American Red Cross doctors were conducting autopsies after the war, they couldn't find any trace of wounds upon the smallest victims. Apparently, to save the price of a bullet, Dr. Stankiewicz ordered that the babies be buried alive. This revolted the SS troops. It was like saying that you gagged a maggot. People were crawling out of the graves alive. But the Belarusians were slavishly devoted to the Nazi cause. And I didn't know about this. I was just a young career Justice Department attorney, volunteered to work on this Nazi war crimes unit for a little while. And when I was down the classified vaults, I came across the Diary of a Jew. And here was a guy who had fought with the Jewish partisans. I don't know if you've seen that movie Defiance that came out.
I personally haven't, though. I know people that haven't very much liked it.
Yeah, the last scene of that movie has a photograph of the actual partisans, and my friend Saul is in the front row, second from the right. So Saul wrote this history of how he fought against the Nazis and the communists and came to America to find freedom. He didn't know it, but he ended up living less than a half an hour away from the men that murdered his family, because the British Secret Service had dumped virtually the entire Nazi puppet government of Belarusia in the town of South River, New Jersey.
John, before we actually get into the Belarus Brigade and their diaspora to the United States and elsewhere, the Einsatzgruppen, what were they, and what accounted for their penchant for recruiting locals? Because the history of the Einsatzgruppen and some of the academics whom we're going to talk about is inextricably linked with that phenomenon.
The Einsatzgruppen were special action groups. They were most often called the mobile killing units. In the beginning, after Dr. Stankiewicz's fiasco, the SS would control the shooting at the pits, and the Belarusians would line the roads to herd the Jews in. And because the Belarusian shooters were too drunk all the time, and it was causing chaos. And then they moved to the next step, which was gas vans. They were little black trucks, and the exhaust pipes were routed to the interior. That didn't work out too well, because the people were literally clawing the metal in their attempts to get out. And so that evolved to the next step of gas chambers. But Belarusia became the first experiment in the Holocaust. Here was a population absolutely enthusiastic about supporting Hitler's goal of ridding the world of Jews. And it's no surprise that when Auschwitz was built as the industrial park as a robber baron, the same geographical factors led for it to become a killing factory as well.
John, in setting the background to how you came to be investigating these characters as a Justice Department investigator, some names familiar to the older listeners, but again, maybe not to younger and newer listeners. Who was Reinhard Gehlen, and how does he factor into the scenario that we're setting forth here?
Reinhard Gehlen was a German general who was chief of German intelligence on the Eastern Front, and he knew all of these collaborators in Belarus and the Ukraine top to bottom. At the end of World War II, the Dulles brothers recruited General Gehlen, brought him to Washington, D.C., and said, hey, look, he's our hero. He's the guy that's going to recruit gigantic network of freedom fighters behind Russian lines. And the British Secret Service was saying, yeah, we would do it, but we don't have the money. So Gehlen was endorsed by the British chief, whose name was Kim Philby. Philby, of course, was the highest-ranking Soviet spy ever to penetrate the British Secret Service. Philby's mission was to get the gullible Americans to take in all the East European Nazis to use as agents in the Cold War, because they were people that the Russians could blackmail. Instead of freedom fighters, we got the dregs of the war criminals. It was a terrible fiasco. And the worst thing was that our State Department and my own agency, the Justice Department, covered it up. I guess you'd have to go back. Remember the Truman Dewey race, the famous newspaper headline,
Sure.
Dewey wins?
Mm-hmm.
Well, Dewey's campaign manager in New York was Allen Dulles. And Dulles had been promised by Dewey, as soon as he won, Dulles would head up a new agency to be called the CIA. Dulles had already started hiring his buddies. Dulles' idea was to cover up his clients' Nazi investments under a shroud of national security. Big problem when Truman got reelected. So for a while there, we actually had two CIAs, one that worked for the President Truman and the Democratic Party, and the other, called the Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, that worked for the Republicans and Allen Dulles. And for 4 years we had two CIAs in America, one that hunted Nazis, one that recruited them. And things got worse when Eisenhower was elected, because Eisenhower put the Dulles brothers in charge of everything. One brother became head of CIA, the other became head of the State Department. And they just turned the faucet and let the Nazi war criminals come into America by the droves. Now, the worst thing they did was to bring in the Arab Nazis. And boy, there's a scandal and a half.
Well, that one, of course, is very much on the front burner today. The Muslim Brotherhood and some of those connections are something I'd like to get into, and primarily inside, too. John, before we develop further the Galen Organization and the OPC and Frank Wisner and the people you were tracking down through OSI, the bankers' trial and what Franklin Roosevelt was hoping to do, the people who were in the dustbin, so to speak, in Germany,
good question.
and Allen Dulles, and how he managed to circumvent that.
Well, my first boss at this new Nazi hunting unit that President Carter set up was a guy who had been one of the bankers' prosecutors at Nuremberg. His name was Walter Rockler. He's now passed away. But Walter told me that the Nuremberg trials were fixed, that something had gone on. And so my secret assignment from him was to find out what had happened, who had fixed the Nuremberg trials, and why. And, what I found out was this whole history of the Wall Street robber barons and how they got involved. So it was, I wore two hats. Officially, I was investigating Belarusian Nazis in America, but they were just a case study and a cover-up for my real job, which is to find out, how the American investors got their money into Nazi Germany and got it out again. The Dulles brothers had absolutely prostituted the interests of America worldwide in making alliances during the Eisenhower administration with the worst dregs of dictators in the world. Anyone that would continue the robber baron strategy of giving Americans economic dominance, monopolies, cartels. It ruined America's image overseas, and we ended up bringing in some of the worst people in the world in this country, people that worked for the Soviets. The Cold War dragged on for so many years because the Russians knew everything that we were doing. There was actually a fatality rate of 98% of the agents that CIA sent behind the Iron Curtain. For years, they censored that out of my book for fear that it would discourage recruitment in the future. It kind of had a point.
Franklin Roosevelt and the bankers' trial, what was he hoping to do, and how did Dulles circumvent that?
Good point. Well, what Roosevelt wanted to do was to use the bankers' trial to have the German bankers point the fingers at their American partners. And then that would cause a public outcry, and Roosevelt could put the American robber barons on trial for aiding the Nazis for treason. Giving aid and comfort to the enemy in time of war is treason. And Roosevelt had more than the two witnesses the Constitution required. He had hundreds of witnesses. In fact, there were 150 Americans who had worked inside the Third Reich all during the war on behalf of American companies. And Dulles had to hide them. So they set up a special prison camp called Ashcan Dustbin after the war. And they hid the Americans, traders, who worked for the American companies, in that camp. And eventually the Justice Department quietly released them all and brought them home. Not a single American was ever tried for treason for helping Hitler before, during, and after the war when they smuggled the Nazi money in.
And basically, the names responsible for this malfeasance, for the crimes of the Third Reich, or at least some of the crimes of the former Soviet Union, and the depredations of the Muslim Brotherhood offshoots like Al-Qaeda and Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad, a lot of the responsibility for that it falls with our own industrial and financial elite.
Yeah, and not the whole elite, but just
sure.
4 or 5% of American corporations. And the Eisenhower administration was their heyday. Eisenhower was put into office by the Dulles brothers. They made him president of Columbia University, and they arranged money for his campaigns. And he was not a good guy. Eisenhower knew a lot of this covert stuff was going on. I don't think that Eisenhower knew about the American investors in Nazi Germany. But that was the point, was that the Rockefellers had to be protected. And in return, the Rockefellers would finance whichever Republican candidates the Dulles brothers picked.
And basically, at the end of the war, the Americans at Ashcan Dustbin simply walked.
Yeah. The Justice Department let them go. The Justice Department of lawyers. These guys, a lot of these guys would, work for a while for justice and then go for a nice career with the Wall Street firms. And, the Justice Department sold us out.
John, we've got about 2 minutes on this side, maybe a little bit less. In reading about the Gehlen Organization and the importation of many of these Nazi functionaries, the people you've been investigating, I would come across something, and I could never figure out whether it was part of the State Department or the CIA. And after reading your books, I understand why I was so confused. We've only got a little over a minute, but let's introduce a topic we'll get into inside, too, the Office of Policy Coordination. What was that?
Well, this was a covert unit. President Truman thought the CIA should only collect intelligence and not get involved in covert operations. The State Department, Office of Policy Coordination, was involved with paramilitary operations, psychological warfare operations. They were hiring ex-Nazis for assassination programs behind the Iron Curtain. And, for example, the Ukrainian version of the Gestapo, the SB, the Sluzhba Bezpa. Those guys were responsible for the deaths of tens of thousands of Ukrainians and Poles and Jews. They murdered Simon Wiesenthal's mother. There was a letter from Frank Wisner at the State Department to the Justice Department saying, okay, look, these guys are coming into the U.S. illegally, but just keep quiet about it because they've assassinated 35,000 Russians behind the Iron Curtain, and they're important for our covert ops. And justice went along with it. In fact, the Attorney General of the United States sponsored Mykola Lebed personally, the head of the SB, for immigration. And years later, when I blew the whistle before Congress, I didn't know it, but the Justice Department lied and said Mykola Lebed was a leader of the anti-Nazi resistance in the Ukraine.
Another manifestation of the big lie. John, we are almost out of time on side one. I'd like to get back to Frank Wisner, another of these white shoe Wall Street lawyers and a person who figures large in America's Nazi secret. However, we are all out of time in side one. This concludes side one of For the Record program number 731, interview with John Loftus about America's Nazi secret. For John Loftus, this is Dave Emory saying thanks for listening. This is being recorded on December 5th of the year 2010. Hello, my name is Dave Emory, and this is side two of For the Record program number 731, interview with John Loftus about America's Nazi secret. This program is being recorded on December 5th of the year 2010. Once again, it is my pleasure and my privilege to bring back to our airwaves John Loftus, former Justice Department investigator and the author of, decades ago, The Belarus Secret, The Secret War Against the Jews on Holy Trinity, the last two co-authored with Mark Ahrens, also The Witness Tree, and most recently out in softcover America's Nazi Secret, published by Trine Day. John, welcome back once again to our airwaves.
Oh, thank you, Dave. Good to be back. God, we've been covering this story for a long time.
We have indeed. We have indeed. And one of the names that you brought up right at the tail end of side one, another of these powerful Wall Street lawyers and an individual who looms very large in this tale, and that is Frank Wisner. And also, in discussing Wisner, remind the listeners again of what the OPC was, the Office of Policy Coordination.
The OPC was the Republican version of the CIA after Dewey lost to Truman. Justice helped the State Department hired up a covert unit, and Allen Dulles picked his friend Frank Wisner to run it. Frank was technically the Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for occupied Germany, but in reality, he was America's first covert warrior. It was Wisner's assistant, Carmel Offey, who recruited all of the Eastern European Nazis from the British and smuggle them to America for training. You know, in the event of World War III, we'd have this giant army of freedom fighters behind Nazi lines. Wisner didn't know it, but his deputy, Carmel Offey, was also a Soviet double agent. So the guy that sold him the networks, Kim Philby, was a Soviet double agent. The guy that Wisner had working for him, Carmel Offey, was a Soviet double agent.
Wisner himself, by the way, we should mention, also was a powerful Wall Street law firm from Carter, Ledyard, and Milburn.
Of course. It was all about the money. It's hard for some of my friends on the right and the left to accept this, but these guys really just did it for the profit. They sold America out for money. But, Dave, isn't that just what the multinational oil corporations do? It's not in America's national interest to keep jacking up oil prices with these oil cartels, but it keeps happening. And Exxon's had their best year in decades, while America's economy is down the toilet.
Corporate profits were setting a record this past quarter, and yet America continues to provide tax breaks for corporations to ship jobs overseas. So I think the cynicism is readily comprehensible under the circumstances, but younger listeners in particular should be aware that cynicism goes way beyond denying unemployment insurance to people around Christmas time. It goes to fascism, terrorism, bringing murderers and so forth to ply their trade from the United States. Frank Wisner was bringing people in courtesy of the Galen organization, and in particular, Einsatzgruppen members. Another name that looms large here with people like Galen, Wisner, and the OPC, Dr. Franz Alfred Seeks. Who was he?
Oh, he was he's an academic, a German academic, and he was the head of the sort of the Russian research desk, if you will, for the Third Reich. But Dr. Six was also one of the Einsatzgruppen leaders, one of the SS Mobile Killing Unit leaders. And his job was to recruit the guides, all the Eastern European collaborators, who would help the German army in their invasion of Russia. And the guides, of course, were later installed as the new puppet governments in the area. So Dr. Six was a despicable war criminal. CIA was trying to arrest him. OPC had hired him. In fact, Dr. Six and Klaus Barbie, another famous war criminal, worked for OPC under the code name War Department Detachment. While the CIA was out trying to arrest these guys and have them prosecuted as war criminals, Dr. Six and Klaus Barbie were working for the State Department. So we really had this schizophrenic system. And I think part of it was the Dulles brothers designed an uncentralized intelligence system for America after World War II, so no one could ever put all the pieces together to indict their clients for their financial collaboration with the Nazis or the Bolsheviks. And we actually had 22 different American intelligence agencies after World War II. And the Dulles brothers invented stovepiping. You couldn't just call the guy in the agency next to you. You had to send it all the way up your chain of command to your boss, and he would send it over to the top of their agency and would work all its way down. So there was lots of opportunities to make sure that investigations got killed. So that's what stovepiping was intended to do, was to prevent the sharing of intelligence. So my feeling is that 9/11 was not only inevitable, but predictable, because that's the way the Dulles brothers and Frank Wisner designed it.
Seeks was involved with OPC, and again, we are talking about the Bielorussian Brigade, which is one of the focal points of your investigation with OSI. How do the Bielorussians fit in with Galen, Wisner, Seeks, and the OPC. How was it that you actually came to be investigating this particular crowd, and tie that in with the names that we've already thrown out for the audience?
Well, the idea was that Galen said, I'm going to re-recruit all of these guys who collaborated with us in the invasion of Russia and put them to work to set up underground spy cells behind Russian lines. So Galen said, I'm going to recruit all of the former Nazi collaborators of Eastern Europe and put them back on my payroll. Just give me money and I'll take care of everything. And the Dulles brothers said, sure, what the heck. The Dulles brothers really didn't care about Galen. All they cared about was that it was a perfect cover for national security, a blanket to throw over their corporate clients' collaboration with the Third Reich. So Galen was just a useful cover story to them. And, of course, Galen was totally incompetent. If he'd been any good, the Germans would have won the war on the Eastern Front. But because of Galen, Nazi war criminals were put on the German intelligence payroll and then the OPC payroll and then finally the CIA payroll. But at the end, the CIA didn't even know which of their employees were Nazis. That's one of the things I wrote in my new book was I revealed a memo I had written to the CIA explaining that a lot of their files had been destroyed by OPC. The CIA just didn't know which of their own employees had been previously employed by the Third Reich.
With regard to Franz Alfred Seeks, an SS war criminal and Einsatzgruppen leader, one of the things that you talk about, and that is a series of events involving some of the Belarusians and others, and that is the genesis of what later was to become the Special Forces, or Green Beret. And in this context, what we're about to talk about should not be misunderstood as casting aspersions on anyone who was in the Special Forces or implying that the Green Beret are war criminals. Yet, the genesis of that organization falls right into this concatenation that you've been describing.
Right. OPC wanted to have, quote, Special Forces, and which later sort of evolved into the Green Beret concept of having local people work with American soldiers to, stir up partisan warfare. And of course, what the real Green Berets didn't know was that the 10th unit in Germany was largely composed of people that had worked for the Nazis on the Russian front. And here was a disaster that, Special Forces were trying to recruit, Eastern European freedom fighters, and the British were doing the security clearances, and the British were feeding us all of these Eastern European war criminals that just sold us out. It was a complete disaster. And a similar thing happened years later with the Arab Nazis. Now, most people haven't heard of the Muslim Brotherhood. They sort of began, they put the House of Saud on the throne, then they went to Egypt. The Egyptian leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, Hassan al-Banna, was a real devotee of Adolf Hitler. In heaven, Allah, on earth, Hitler. And he had an army of 750,000 Arab Nazis. And these guys were war criminals and terrorists. Not one of them was prosecuted. In fact, the worst of them, the Arab Nazi ambassador to Berlin, was the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem. He was Hitler's favorite Arab. Hitler personally briefed him on his plans to extend the Holocaust to the Middle East and North Africa. And Hitler's aide said, "My Führer, why would you tell all of our most sensitive state secrets to this Arab?" And Hitler said, "Because they support our goals so enthusiastically." Now, the Muslim Brotherhood was never prosecuted because they were hired right away by the British Secret Service, Kim Philby again, because they wanted to use the Arab Nazi movement to crush the infant state of Israel. Well, that didn't work so well. And so when the new secular Arab government came in Egypt, Nasser was very concerned about this huge army of Arab Nazis running around the country, complete with their original German handlers. So Nasser ordered them thrown out. By this time, Eisenhower had been elected, Dulles was in charge of CIA, and he had to find a place to hide the Arab Nazis. So he asked the Saudis to take him in. The Saudis liked the Nazis anyway. Besides, most of the Egyptian Nazis were literate. The Saudis gave them jobs as school teachers. So we had a perfect storm of hatred. We had Nazi racism mixed with Islamic extremist bigotry. What the Saudi version of Islam is really a heresy. It's been condemned as a heresy more than 60 times before World War II. So we had Nazis as school teachers in Saudi Arabia. So the chief Nazi propagandist, Sayyid Qutb, his brother Muhammad Qutb, was the tutor of a young man named Osama bin Laden, as well as Dr. al-Zahri of Egypt. So it's no surprise that these guys grew up infused with Nazi ideology. Now, Dulles' idea, when he brought the Muslim Brotherhood into the U.S. in the 50s, was to use the Muslim Brotherhood as a proxy army of Arab Nazis to fight the Arab communists during the Cold War. Now, of course, it was a real farce, but, during the 1980s, Vice President Bush actually, took the Arab Nazis out of the closet for the last time and used them to recruit the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. But this was too much even for the Saudis. They wouldn't let this crazy army of second-generation Nazis back into their country, so they paid them off to stay out of Saudi Arabia and go bomb somewhere else. And they eventually did on 9/11. What the 9/11 Commission doesn't know is that the Justice Department and the State Department have withheld all the Muslim Brotherhood files from them. And there was a huge Muslim Brotherhood support network for al-Qaeda in the U.S. that helped the 9/11 bombers. To this day, America is the only Western nation that doesn't declare the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist group. Even the Arab states do that.
Do you think, John, that it would be fair to describe the Brotherhood activists and also some of their supporters in the corporate community and the intelligence system as literally a fifth column within the country?
Oh, I think so. I mean, the FBI knew that the Muslim Brotherhood was untouchable. The FBI is part of the Justice Department. And they were actually recruiting Islamic terrorists in the U.S., knowing that they were killing Jews in Israel. They were part of the Arab terrorist groups. In fact, there was a very famous case that I got involved with. A professor here in Florida named Sami Al-Arian, who was actually on the world board of a terrorist group, the Palestinian Islamic Jihad, one of the splinter factions of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the FBI was trying to recruit him as an informant. So I got frantic calls from people in the FBI and CIA saying, "You're going to help us. The Justice Department won't allow us to touch this guy." So what I did was I donated money to Professor Al-Arian's charities and then sued him to find out where my money had gone and exposed him as a major terrorist leader in America.
John, something that I found fascinating, and that is the account of yours and private investigator Bill Warner's gambit in order to help scope out just who these people were. Describe that for us.
Oh, that was hilarious. Bill Warner came to me right after the Al-Arian case and said he had this great idea. If I gave him the names of, terrorist supporters of Sami Al-Arian in America, terrorist suspects, he was going to send them advertisements. And Bill's advertisement was, "Try our international calling card free for 90 days, and we hope that you sign up with our phone service." Well, one of the idiots actually did it. And once we had his phone records, then we were able to legally go to other phone companies and purchase the calling records of the people that he called to solicit further customers. So, in essence, we became the Muslim Brotherhood's phone company, and they didn't know it. It was absolutely remarkable. So Bill kept, he remortgaged his house, took out $20,000, and kept buying more and more phone records. And within a year after 9/11, I had correlated those records against terrorist attacks around the world, and were able to show, for example, that every time a certain guy in Los Angeles in the Muslim Brotherhood called a Palestinian refugee camp in Jordan, that a terrorist attack in Israel would take place that same day. We're able to show 100% correlation against al-Qaeda operations. It was just incredible. So we turned this giant phone database over to Northern Command, part of the U.S. military responsible for protecting America. We said, we think we have a map here of every terrorist logistical support cell in America. And when the military ran it through their computers, it lit up like a Christmas tree. They couldn't believe it. They knew that there were numbers overseas were terrorists. They didn't know who they were calling in America. So the military asked the FBI to come in to help them get search warrants and computer taps. And the FBI typically took credit for the operation. Neither Bill Warner nor I ever got the $1 million reward for justice for, tracking down terrorists. But what did happen is, as soon as the FBI found out that we had identified the Muslim Brotherhood, they all stopped using our phone cards.
And so basically they got wind of what was going on.
Sure, the FBI tipped them off.
And so basically what has happened, and we've seen this in numerous contexts, that citizens who were successfully investigating these things at the grassroots level, then had their investigations deliberately deep-sixed by people in the ranks of the Justice Department and other government agencies that are supposed to be doing that very sort of investigation.
I'll give you another example. This guy, Samuel Arian, I talked about, the Muslim Brotherhood, had also set up a gigantic stolen car ring in America. Because you can steal a luxury car in America, ship it to Saudi Arabia, and sell it for 3 times its value. So we actually found that the purchaser of these stolen cars was a member of the Al-Qaeda Golden Chain. That's the top financiers of Osama bin Laden. And the cars that wouldn't fetch a big price, the older ones, were made into car bombs and used against American soldiers in Iraq. We found in at least 2 cases through the vehicle identification numbers of cars that have been stolen in America, shipped through Al-Arian's network here in Tampa, and were later used as car bombs to kill American soldiers.
The overall threat.
I'm sorry, Dave. The point of this is that the investigation was quashed by the FBI. Secret Service, Customs, ICE were all coming to me saying, "What the heck is going on? Here is this major investigation." Never made the light of day. They closed it all down.
And you mentioned that the Justice Department had been trying to recruit him as an informant. Do you think the fact that he was a political ally of George Bush had anything to do with the cover-up?
Well, gee, let me see. Al-Arian said, "I will deliver the state of Florida to you in your first run for president, Mr. Bush." And he did. Al-Arian claimed credit for offsetting the Arab vote against the Jewish vote in Florida and tipping the scale in the very, very narrow Bush versus Gore race. So Al-Arian got his picture taken with the president, and the Muslim Brotherhood became big guns in the White House and in the leadership of the FBI. Now, don't get me wrong. 99% of the folks in the FBI are good, decent people, and they were outraged at what their bosses were doing. That's how I ended up involved in all this stuff again. But it was just a political travesty. It goes back to what Nixon did with the Eastern European Nazis. We actually found a State Department briefing letter in Australia saying, "Yeah, we know where the Eastern European Nazis are in America, but we keep quiet about it because they're important to get out the emigre vote, the ethnic vote, in 5 key states." So, just as the Eastern European Nazis were Nixon's, answer to the Jewish vote for Jack Kennedy, Samuel Arian, the Arab vote in Florida, was the answer to the Jewish vote for Al Gore.
And in fact, Grover Norquist and Karl Rove went out of their way to recruit people like Al-Arian and other Muslim Brotherhood functionaries to the GOP, specifically to counteract, quote, the Jewish vote, unquote. John, we've gone through some of the events that led to the scenario that you were investigating as a young Justice Department lawyer. The OSI, what was it? And once you began investigating the crew whose background and history you've delineated for us, what happened to you and the OSI once you began to, basically to wrestle with this buzzsaw?
Well, they discovered that many of the Nazis had been assigned to prosecute were on the CIA payroll. See, I didn't have a clue because these guys had come in from the State Department with phony biographies. And, but it was really an enormous scandal because it showed that the Attorney General of the United States had disobeyed President Truman and had personally sponsored Nazi war criminals in coming in. So I was threatened with imprisonment if I spoke out. So the way around that was congressional hearings. So I ended up on 60 Minutes and caused a national uproar. Congress demanded congressional hearings. Mike Wallace got the Emmy Award. My family got the death threats. But the congressional hearings now discovered were fixed. That the Justice Department had gone behind my back and made sure that there was no secret session, no executive session where I could discuss the classified files. And I didn't know why. I didn't know at that time that the Arab Nazis, I'd seen all their files, were back on the payroll again. That Vice President Bush, back in 1985, had hired the Arab Nazis to go fight the Russians in Afghanistan. And I didn't know that the Justice Department itself was lying through its teeth to Congress, portraying guys like Mykola Lebed, the head of the Ukrainian version of the Gestapo, who were telling Congress that he was the leader of the anti-Nazi resistance. What a horrible lie. So the Justice Department has committed fraud on Congress not once, but twice. And they're going to keep on getting away with it until we put some lawyers in jail. And that's why I wrote the book. I lived long enough to outwait all the censorship, and the 30-year time barrier expired. Now these guys have to face public inquiry.
And you were threatened with disbarment as well, right?
Oh, yeah. Mark Richard, the Deputy Assistant Attorney General, John Keegan, the Deputy Assistant Attorney General, disbarred and imprisoned, no doubt about it. In fact, my book, America's Nazi Secret, came out on Veterans Day in November, and before a single review could be written, and 3 days later, the Justice Department leaked a 600-page report to the New York Times that had prepared, saying, oh, this was all exaggeration. Maybe we let a few Nazis in and we lied about it a little bit, but, you know, they were pleading to the misdemeanor to avoid the felony charges that I was raising. They're not going to get away with it. The Justice Department is absolutely nailed on the case of Mykola Lebed. The Attorney General sponsored him, and the Justice Department lied about him to Congress. There's no way they can make a lot of it.
One of the things you talk about, there are so many different levels or modes of obstruction for these powerful truths. And again, these are facts and investigations which would reveal the most profound connections between some of the most powerful corporate names in America and some of the most heinous enemies that Americans have fought and died fighting against through much of the century, ranging from the Axis powers of World War II, the Bolsheviks, or communists as they were later known, and most recently Muslim Brotherhood and its various offshoots like Al-Qaeda. When you began investigating that, John, obviously some very direct pressure was directed against you, and you've talked about other types of obstruction. We've only got a few minutes left, but the archives themselves have been deliberately misplaced or set up in such a way as to make it almost impossible to retrieve information.
Sure. One of the things I did for CIA, the funny thing is that most of the CIA were the white hats. They were still out hunting Nazis, trying to prevent these guys from coming in. And I wrote a memo explaining how their files had been shredded and showing them exactly how it had happened. And they were just stunned. So I think that's one of the reasons why the CIA declassified all of their Justice Department correspondence files for me. And that was what I needed to make the case. I've included some of these key documents in my new book to show exactly how a former Justice Department official who worked for CIA lied to the CIA and then to Congress about how justice had protected the Ukrainian Nazis.
In addition to legislative gambits, media attempts at covering this stuff have been deep-sixed. John, you talked about a Canadian documentary that was basically canceled because of the pressure of a fellow named Steve Roman. Describe that for us, or develop that for us, if you would.
Oh, that was great. Yeah, Steve Roman was the wealthiest man in Canada. He was Richard Nixon's partner in the uranium mines up in Canada. And Roman found out that I was working with Canadian Broadcasting Corporation on a documentary about the Pope's visit to Canada. But we were watching the Pope, filming the Pope dedicating a new Slovakian cathedral in Canada, and we were zeroing in all the Nazi war criminals in the audience. It was a real scandal. So Roman, being a Slovakian, wanted the whole thing canceled, and he threatened to tie up CBC with years of litigation and wreck their budget. They're like their equivalent of, NPR. And the cowardly Canadians backed down, and the show never aired. Now, a similar thing happened. A good friend of mine, Claire Regay, she and I has been working on an independent documentary film for the last 5 years, and it's very powerful. It goes through all the declassified documents now showing how America's finest families funded Hitler. And the film will be released next year, and I think it's going to cause an international scandal, because with it will be a website with all the new documents showing exactly how this stuff happened. Now, just last year, all of a sudden, all of Claire's bank accounts were seized by the IRS. No notice, no trial, nothing. And, luckily she had, independent funding to get good lawyers, and that nonsense was stopped. But for a while there, we were afraid that the American documentary was going to go the same way as the Canadian documentary, just get, buried. But I think the truth is going to come out.
John, one thing that I don't think I don't think we're going to have time. We're almost out of time in the interview. But this has been recorded in Los Altos Hills, which borders on the city of Palo Alto. And Stanford University, or the Farm as it's known hereabouts, is one of the major institutions. And, of course, a very respectable, justifiably respectable education. You write about Alexander Dolan. Tell him about that. That was hysterical.
Yeah, he was the former chairman of the history department at Stanford. I raided his offices when I was a prosecutor with OSI, and found that he had stolen, bunches of Nazi intelligence files. In fact, his entire book, Russia Under German Rule, was plagiarized from an SS officer who was a wanted war criminal. And so Dolan was just a crook. Stanford and Harvard owe the academic community huge apologies for perpetrating frauds upon the academic community with their so-called Russian research. It was just, thinly disguised Nazi propaganda.
And one of the reasons why so many of these consummately important facts have not come to light is because basically a lot of these people know what side their bread is buttered on. John, for many years I've viewed you as a real American hero. I'm a tough SOB. I don't hand out that kind of praise easily, but I had no idea what you had been facing on the physiological front. And I'd like to conclude this broadcast by reading a footnote, and I'll apologize to you and the audience for breaking broadcast etiquette. But on page 46 you write, of course, you were a former Army officer. During the 1970s and 1980s, I had more than 24 surgeries for broken facial bones and sinus damage from a parachute accident when I was an Army officer. The VA missed a few things. In the 1990s, I was also diagnosed by private physicians with colon cancer, prostate blockage, kidney stones, and shoulder damage, each of which required surgery. In 2010, the VA finally discovered that I had 2 displaced hips, several broken ribs, broken vertebrae, and crushed discs, which they somehow missed during the last 4 decades of treatment. The VA conceded that more likely than not, these undiscovered injuries had been sustained in my Army parachute accident. There are third world countries that provide better medical care than America gives its disabled veterans. I have just one word after reading that, John. Wow. I mean, that is an amazing thing to navigate while you're basically tangling with the machinery of the American power structure.
Yeah, no one ever knew how ill I was, but I have a good family. They were very supportive, and I kept up the fight. And I lived long enough to be able to blow the whistle.
And the blowing of that whistle can be found between the covers of America's Nazi Secret, just out in softcover, published by Trine Day Publishers from Oregon. The author, John Loftus, who has been my guest for the last hour. And this concludes Side 2 of For the Record program number 731, interview with John Loftus about America's Nazi Secret. For John Loftus, this is Dave Emory saying thanks for listening. This has been recorded on December 5th of the year 2010.